This stop-motion chicken puppet is made from rubber latex, foam strips, craft feathers, doll dress, using a process of sculpting, mold making, body buildup, and the dress with some special rigging. And this tutorial is about how this was all done. Started with a ball and socket armature, but a wire armature will work just as well for this process. Bought a doll costume, because I don't sew, and used Van Atkin clay. Though Roma clay would actually be better, not quite in my budget for this one. Wrapped the armature in floral tape, because it's a flexible tape. Heated the clay so it's easier to work, and sculpted directly onto the armature to make sure it would fit. One point, removed one of the feet so that I could match them up perfectly, lining them up and building up on top so they have a little bit more leg. And at this stage, just kept measuring as I would go to make sure that the foot would fit back on, continuously making sure that they would be the same size, and then sculpted on detail. I'm using aluminum foil to create a rough texture, and in this case, the goal is to make the chicken feet just kind of ugly, as chicken feet are, in contrast to what would hopefully be a cute chicken face. Cutting in texture and then using rubbing alcohol brushed into the clay to smooth it out. And this is also, by the way, where Roma clay works much better. These texturing tools is Sculpey, which has the inverse of the texture sculpted in and then baked, so it can be rubbed on the clay and leave the texture. And then once the feet were done, the mold making process starts by gluing the feet onto a platform and filling in the gaps with Super Sculpey. The plaster is going to get poured on here, and so they need to work out where the seam is going to be. And so the Sculpey is worked right up against the feet, and a box is created to hold the plaster that's going to be poured in. And so this is glued onto the platform, and hot glue is used to close up every gap. It's got to be airtight. Got to be waterproof, seals all the way around it. If you can't reach an area, I use a sculpting tool to work the hot glue in. And then using mold release, can also use candle spray to give a light layer over the clay, and then in other areas using petroleum jelly. This is as a mold release on the edge. And so I'm using Hydrocal, that's the best, it preserves the detail. I've used plaster Paris as well. Mixing it in and until it is the consistency of yogurt. This is poured onto the mold, and the important thing is to try to avoid air bubbles. And so this is done by pouring it right directly over the clay, using a brush, a soft brush, to work the plaster into everywhere, into all the gaps, and then shaking it. Shaking gets the bubbles out. And then once that's in, continuing to add the plaster until it's full, and then once it is hardened up, removing the mold, and then the clay. Wanted to do this, or not removing the clay yet, removing the Super Sculpey and repairing to prepare for the next mold phase, the second half of the mold. Once again, a wall is built up around around it and sealed up airtight. Then little pry holes are added using soft clay so that they can be removed later. This will give something to pry open the mold once it's finished. And same process again of adding the plaster and brushing in to avoid air bubbles and to get the plaster in everywhere, giving it a shake to get all the bubbles to rise to the top. Once it's done, preferably while it's still, the clay is still soft, because the plaster warms the clay, and that makes it easier to remove. I've had a terrible time cleaning out molds that I've waited 2 or 3 days to clean out. After washing the mold, cleaning it up really good. I mix some paint to the color that I want, and then add rubber latex. The rubber latex is then brushed into the mold, layer by layer, the thin layer first, because the first layer has to make sure that there's no air bubbles. So you do this one extra careful, extra thin, to make sure it's going to dry thoroughly. Now, when you add the rubber latex to the paint, it lightens the color, but this is only temporary. Once the rubber latex dries, it returns to the original color of the paint that you mixed. This process, by the way, works very good with shoes. Here's a mold I made of the top and bottom of shoes. And so, second and third layers of rubber latex are painted on. It's a long process. It's mostly the drying process. Once it's thick enough, adding the armature for the feet, the toes. I want to be able to animate the toes flopping around, so I'm adding wire armatures into the toes, and that's epoxy putty holding them together. And then with the rubber latex added to the edges, the mold is closed up with some weight on the top. And then once that's dry, this is carefully opened and the feet removed. That's epoxy putty holding the feet, the toe wires onto the armature. The flange is trimmed off, then using super glue, or in this case Zap-A-Gap, to close up the gaps, and then using rubber latex to fill in the gaps, trying to eliminate the seam as much as possible. Then a slit is cut for the tie down, not a hole, because then the slit will close up when the foot is lifted, and then we can see the bottom of the feet in action. Then working on the head, I've got a piece of balsa wood at the core to keep it lightweight, and then after a layer of clay, work out where the eyeballs are going to go. I use stand-in eyes that I don't mind to get damaged in the mold making process. Putting on the beak fairly early on in the main parts just to see where everything is going to go. And again, using texture tools. A principle here is that everything should have a texture. You should give everything a texture because everything will have a texture. Even if you do a light texture, like in this case just using a toothbrush to make it rough, because if you don't apply a texture, the texture will be by default hand-sculpted clay. And if that's not what you want, then you should add at least something. In this case, I'm adding sort of a light feather texture and an even lighter texture there, so that in the end everything has a texture to it. And once it's done for the mold making part, removing the top part to mold separately, and then building up clay all around the edge to where the seam is going to be. We determine where the seam is, usually just halfway through the head, so that it can be the mold can be pulled out easily. And rather than having a straight edge running along here, I am following the line of the feathers. This, I believe, will help hide the seam once the rubber latex has to be connected again. We'll see if it works. As with the feet, I am building up walls along the edge, closing it up airtight, so that the plaster won't leak out. There's the petroleum jelly along the edge. I did spray it with mold release. And in this case, instead of filling it and having a big heavy mold, once I have got the plaster covering the beak with no air holes, and it's set up a little bit, I've sculpted the plaster over the beak, so it's not as heavy. It's covering it fine. There's at least a ½ inch of plaster. And then, again, going over the reverse side, you can see I've got the pry holes ready to go in. And working out the plaster, again, sculpting it to make it, use less plaster also. And there are going to be air bubbles, and these can be sculpted over using Super Sculpey. Just fill it in. Make it smooth, and then start to apply the rubber latex. Applying paint to the rubber makes it possible to make sure that the color will be there, that the paint gets scratched off that's added later, that the proper color is going to be underneath. The wire to make it possible to move the brows and the beak are then added once there's enough layers of rubber. And then for the back of the head, where there's going to be good stiff rubber, where I don't want there to be a lot of give, I add extra reinforcement using cheesecloth. This also cuts down on just how many layers of rubber need to be added. This is also done on the front of the face where I don't want there to be give. In this case, on the cheeks, upper part of the beak. I'm applying some glue and gluing on the original balsa wood core for the head, adding some padding to the back so that it will butt right up against the back of the head, because I don't want this part to go rattling around in the head. Later I can add some padding to fill it in as well. I add a little rubber latex to the edges to sort of glue both sides together, and then eventually duct tape had to get into this project somewhere, using it to secure the mold together. Once it's dried, using the fan again, making sure it's really dry, the mold is carefully taken apart. The face is always difficult to pull out. Just got to be patient, got to work with it, work in tools. And once it's out, cutting away the flange, cutting away all the parts of the rubber that aren't supposed to be there. And then once they're all off, all the seams are glued together. I'm using tape to just to hold them together once it's glued, and again using duct tape to close up some really big gaps and some areas. It's not permanent. It doesn't have to permanently hold them together because again rubber latex is going to come in, and in this case just sort of sculpting the thick rubber latex to look like the feathers that are around it. A tongue is a separate piece from a separate mold that's added with some wire in it and rubber latex used to connect it. I'm not concerned about the color here because I'm going to paint the entire inside of the mouth. It's not going to be yellow. The wattles came from a separate mold, and they are attached and secured using the rubber latex with a little bit of red paint added. Again, it will dry the same color. The comb got its own separate mold so that it would have no seam, and also it was made especially thin, just a few layers of rubber so that it could bounce around easily, using a wire armature that was made to fit. It's inserted with some extra foam added to fill in gaps so that it would hold its shape. This is then added to the top, secured in tight, and glued on, and again using rubber latex to secure. Also using the rubber latex to make blink shapes, all separate. Brushed directly onto some plastic eyes so that they will come off. For painting, mixing the color that I want first and then adding just some rubber latex. All the paint that goes onto here has to have the rubber latex added or it will crumble off. I'm using a dry brush sort of method here where I'm adding the darker colors and then wiping it off so that the darker colors will remain in the gaps, and then using some additional yellow to cover over the top. And then working through painting all the different parts to add the color, and then the dry brush. The dry brush approach, even adding on some paint and then wiping it back off again, brings out the texture, shows off the texture that you added, the rough edges. It grabs the raised parts. Okay, so now then we're building up the puppet body. First, building up some bulk using cotton batting strips from quilt making, giving it some the main part of the body so that it will keep it lightweight. And now I'm wrapping the whole thing in pre-wrap. This has some stretch to it so that as it's applied, different tightness or looseness in different areas can help give it some shape, make the arms thin where I want them to be thin, the body thinner where I want it to be thinner, and then smooth out and with rubber cement. And then even the tail gets the pre-wrap. So this is just a dress fitting, seeing how it's going to work. Want to make sure that the dress fits tight. If it doesn't, go back and add some more foam because I don't want any give on this dress. Otherwise, it's going to chatter during the animation. I can find all the parts where it is going to chatter. In this case, the lower part of the dress, and I am running armature wire through the dress and both around the edges and then within the dress itself to make sure that I can actually animate the dress and it'll hold in place. Using craft feathers, cutting them down to size and gluing them on. Again, using rubber cement. This is just a final layer just to have a real texture. And this approach here could also be used with fur and hair, that a hair can be cut off of a material and then applied. This is how, like a dog would be done. Even using this method on the tail, and then using spray adhesive, because you can see that just the feathers on their own would just chatter endlessly in the animation process. So I'm using some spray adhesive to hold it down. And then finally, with all of those parts created, the dress comes on. And the final thing to make sure is that everything is on tight and secure and doesn't have any give to it. All of the arms and legs have to move the way you'd want them. The head cannot have any rattle to it. It has to be on there tight. The eyes, when they have a hole drilled into them, can be animated using a pin, sliding them around in the eye socket. Well, that was a lot of information for 17 minutes. There are books written on this subject that get into a lot more detail, but hopefully this was enough to get you started and to come up with ideas for your own stop-motion puppet.